Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this policy exchange panel discussion. My name is Jeffrey Owen. I'm going to chair the session. I'm working at Policy Exchange mainly in the area of industrial policy, innovation, and so on. I'm very sorry indeed that that one of our panel members had to drop out suddenly earlier today. Donald Bryden has been very, very sudden and serious family illness, and he couldn't come. But we've got three excellent speakers who I'm sure will do a fine job when we come to that. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. So we're going to talk about the future of capitalism, but with a particular focus on the role of companies, on the role of public companies in particular. Who are they responsible to? How far should the obligation to shareholders be modified or altered? How do they accommodate the interests of stakeholders, non-shareholder stakeholders, those sort of issues which we want to talk about. Do shareholders have too much power, and does that power have the effect of causing companies to do things which damage social welfare? What can be done to ensure that they make their maximum contribution to social welfare? Those questions will come up in our discussion, but any other topics also can be raised when we come to the question session. I think at the sort of back of it all, there is an issue of, is there a crisis? Is there a crisis in capitalism? Are there flaws in the system that urgently need to be put right, or is the system more or less working as it should be, and only minor changes need to be made? So those are the questions which I hope we can talk about. So to discuss these matters, we've got three speakers who are coming at it from different angles. Colin Mayer, who's a professor at the Said Business School in Oxford, who's been a long-time student, writer about corporate governance and company law in the UK and internationally. More recently, he has led a rather important study, which possibly some of you may have been involved with, led by the British Academy on the future of the corporation. And Colin has also set out his views in two much praised books, one called Firm Commitment and the other more recently, Prosperity. Roger Barker from the Institute of Directors is Director of Policy and Governance at the Institute, and he too has been very much involved over quite a longish period in the kind of post-Cadbury debate about how corporate governance should be organized, how it should be reformed, and so on. And then Trevor Phillips at the end, who's associated with Policy Exchange, which is very familiar to you as a journalist and broadcaster. But he's also chair of the Green Park Group, which is a consultancy focused on leadership, particular interest in diversity, and he comes at it from a slightly different point of view from the other two. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask the three speakers to talk briefly, maybe five minutes or a bit more. Then the four of us will have a short discussion arising from what's been said by the speakers, and then I will open it up for questions. We aim to finish the proceedings at 6:30 or soon after 6:30. So I'm going to start by asking Colin if he could start the proceedings.
Okay, Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me to be here this afternoon. And I'll start off by trying to answer the exam question that we were posed, namely, to whom are companies responsible? And like all good students, I'll start off by slightly changing the exam question by replacing the word responsible with the word accountable. And in answering that question, to whom should companies be accountable, I will say that, in my view, there's a one-word answer, and that is shareholders. Shareholders are the providers of the risk capital of a firm. They are the residual claimants, and quite correctly, we give the shareholders of a firm the rights of approval and removal of the boards of directors. And if anything, what we want to see going forward is a greater degree of engagement by shareholders in holding companies to account. Because the profits are the lifeblood of business. They are the basis on which companies resource their activities, they incentivize people, and they provide the mechanism by which companies raise capital. And share capital is critical not just in terms of fundraising, but also in terms of providing incentives to management. So some of the pressure that's recently been put on the notion of using restricted stock as a way of incentivizing management is indeed a very important way of enhancing incentives on companies. So I begin by making these points because a lot of the debate has been framed in terms of a contrast or a conflict between stakeholder interest and shareholder interest. And I think that that's a rather empty and sterile debate because it's not really about stakeholders versus shareholders. It's about how can one ensure that there is a benefit both to shareholders and to stakeholders. So it's not so much a matter of either or as both and. And I think that that's important because there's a tendency to, I think, slightly misunderstand what a lot of people are saying in this area alongside the stuff that I've been writing, and a number of prominent academics in this field are Rebecca Henderson at the Harvard Business School and Alex Edmonds at the London Business School. And the point that we're really all focusing on is not so much stakeholders versus shareholders. It's about the nature of the purpose of business. And as many of you will be aware, in 2018, Larry Fink, the CEO and president of the largest investment management business in the world, BlackRock, said that every business needs to have a purpose. Not a strapline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of its fundamental reason for being. Purpose, he said, is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force for achieving them. And then in August of the following year, 2019, we had the Business Roundtable coming out with its declaration of dropping its 1997 statement of the purpose of business in favor of one that said that the purpose of business is about delivering value to customers, investing in employees, supporting society, caring for customers, and delivering long-term value to shareholders. So basically, what all of these people are saying is that one should think about the purpose of business in terms of delivering both beneficial outcomes for society, the environment, and for shareholders. Now, the purpose of a business is the reason why it exists, why it's created, its reason for being. And in thinking about the purpose of a business, one should recognize that a purpose of a business is not simply to produce profits. The purpose of a business is to solve problems that you and I face as individuals, societies, and the natural world, and to do so in a way that is commercially viable and profitable. And so the way in which we define the purpose of a business is in terms of producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. Now, that notion of delivering solutions in a profitable form is not about philanthropy or CSR. It's not about stakeholder interests versus shareholder interests. It's about what is core to a business, the way in which a business is structured, and the objectives of businesses. And it's precise about what problems businesses are there to solve, for whom, how they should solve them, and why they're particularly well suited to solve them in ways that are commercially viable and profitable and create value for shareholders as well. Now, we've been working with the boards in Oxford. We've been working with the boards of some of the largest companies around the world, in Europe and in North America, in terms of trying to assist them with what a lot of companies are increasingly trying to do, and that is to adopt corporate purposes along these lines. And we set out a framework for doing that, which we call the SCORE framework, which sets out how companies, it's an acronym for how companies should promote it. And the 5 letters of SCORE stand for the notions of, first of all, S for simplifying, to bring real clarity to the notion of a corporate purpose. The second letter, C, is to connect it in particular with the strategy of the company so that it promotes a strategy of delivering profitable solutions, and also to connect it to the other parties who assist it with doing that. The third letter, O, is about ownership, about the ownership of that purpose, not just the formal ownership of the company, but ensuring that that purpose is really owned throughout the organization, from the top to the bottom, to the shop floor. The fourth letter is about rewarding, and that links into the way in which its performance is measured and incentivizing people appropriately in the organization in relation to its purpose. And the fifth letter, E, is about exemplifying, to bring it to life, to give it meaning, so that there's authenticity on the part of leaders in terms of delivering on that purpose. Now, that notion of a purpose and the way of delivering of it really has very significant implications for the way in which business operates. Because what it does is it helps to align this notion of how companies can create value for their shareholders in a way that is not contrary to the interests of the rest of us as customers, employees, communities, or the environment. And in particular, to find ways in which, through focusing on that purpose, they can address precisely the sorts of problems that we are currently encountering in relation to the pandemic, in relation to the environmental crises, in relation to the sorts of political disturbances and problems that we're currently confronting. And it's inspiring for people in companies to work with that type of objective, and therefore it addresses another issue or crisis we're facing, and that is on recruitment, and particularly of talent. And I finally want to just end by illustrating this in relation to one company. It's a Danish pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk, which makes insulin. And insulin is used in the treatment of type 2 diabetes as well as type 1 diabetes around the world. And its purpose used to be simply to produce and sell insulin. But then it realized that actually that wasn't really its purpose, because some 80% of type 2 diabetes is found in low and middle income countries, many of which could not afford to purchase its insulin. So it started working with doctors, hospitals, and universities around the world to promote a different purpose, and that was to help people treat type 2 diabetes. And through those partnerships, it recognized that there are mechanisms of treating type 2 diabetes that do not involve taking insulin, and in many cases are more appropriate in different parts of the world. And then it realized that its purpose was even more than that, to help people stop getting type 2 diabetes in the first place. So it started working with governments, local health authorities, and health workers in identifying changes in lifestyles that helped people avoid getting type 2 diabetes. Now, you might say that's all very well and worthy, but doesn't it undermine Novo Nordisk's business model of selling insulin? And the answer is no. It did exactly the opposite. Its business boomed on the back of it. And why did it boom? Because it became a trusted provider of both health products and advice around the world. It built up relations of trust from which it could then expand its activities around the world. Now that, I think, illustrates two vital points, one of which is the importance of having a clarity of a purpose of a company. And secondly, that if you can bring clarity and a real commitment to the delivery of it, it creates the most valuable asset that a company can have, and that is to be trusted, to be a trustworthy provider. And I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Let me start by straight away saying I do think that there is a defect in the system of capitalism that we have now. It's not a defect in capitalism per se, it's a problem with the existing flavour or variety of capitalism that we have, which is very much centred on the role of shareholders and putting shareholders first. Let me then, to answer and explain why that's the case, let me address, just as Colin did, the exam question which was set, to whom are companies responsible? My answer to that is actually to say it's to society. They are responsible to society. Companies exist within society. That may seem like a rather obvious statement, but a lot of people seem to think that the business world is operating in parallel to the world of the rest of society. It has its own rules of the game, it has its own agenda, it has its own measures of success. But I have felt, and I think people generally increasingly feel, that it's a fallacious distinction to think of business and society or business and government as operating in separate spheres. Business operates at the service of society. And when it starts to deviate from what society is expecting, whether in terms of law or in terms of norms of behaviour or expectations of conduct, we see business running into problems very quickly. I mean, look at what has been happening to P&O Ferries recently, when I think that they've realised that the way that they have been behaving isn't in accordance with what society expects. Now, of course, that's the big picture, that companies are ultimately responsible to society. But we're not living in a command economy. There are many thousands, many millions of independent enterprises operating in markets around the world. And who are they responsible to? Well, I would argue that the people they're responsible to are their boards of directors. In large companies nowadays, most directors are independent persons. They're not playing a role in the management of the company. They don't have any other kind of vested interest in the company. They are there to promote the success of the company. And they, unlike shareholders, have actually a legal fiduciary duty to the company to actually achieve that. So it's the board of directors. And as the US Roundtable, which Colin mentioned in 2018, said, what boards of directors are overseeing is actually teamwork, a team effort, which is mobilizing resources from a variety of stakeholders, employees, suppliers, providers of finance, shareholders, yes, a great CEO and a terrific management team, bringing them all together to create corporate success. And I think any good business leader would realize that that is what business, effective business, is all about, an effective team effort. So if that's what you're trying to achieve in business, why on earth would you place one particular group, one particular stakeholder, in priority above all the others. After all, I mean, shareholders are just holders of one category of financial security, equity securities. Why would you create a system in which they have primacy, that actually it's their interests that count more than any others, and that ultimately it's reasonable to sacrifice the interests of any other stakeholder in order to fulfill the interests of shareholders? I don't think that that makes any sense, and it's making increasing less sense as we go through time. But why has it come about? I think one of the reasons it's come about is that there is this, what I think is a fallacious argument, which is often put forward, which is that shareholders own companies. Now, nowhere in company law does it say that shareholders own companies. Shareholders own shares. That is the extent of their ownership. And of course, as holders of those shares, they have certain very significant rights to influence company decision making. They decide who's on the board of the directors, they can approve significant transactions, and of course they have the right to the residual value which is left over if the company ultimately becomes insolvent. But they don't own the company, and I think we need to move away from that. I mean, another rationale for shareholder primacy is that it's shareholders taking the risk in an enterprise. You've got to compensate them for the risk. They're putting the money into the company. They've no guarantee of getting any return. Well, I don't find that persuasive either. I mean, all stakeholders involved in a company are taking a risk. If you go to work for a company, you're taking a risk. If you enter into a contract with a company, you are taking a risk. And of course, most institutional shareholders can diversify away much of their risk by having diversified portfolios. So that isn't a very persuasive argument. For me, what it comes down to is having shareholder primacy in place, is that, pragmatically speaking, going to deliver the best outcome for our economy and our society? And I think there are a lot of doubts as to whether that truly is the case. I mean, does shareholder capitalism drive a long-term business approach? Does it drive high levels of research and development? Does it encourage people to invest for the long term? I don't think it does. There's very little evidence that that is the case when one looks at public companies. Is shareholder capitalism the system that is going to help our economy and our society make the transition to net zero, to decarbonise the economy and put the economy on a more sustainable footing? Well, there's no evidence that that is going to happen. I mean, certainly based on the track record of the last 30 years, where externalities have been a real problem of that system. Are shareholders good at overseeing companies, boards and management, and making sure they do a good job? Well, modern institutional investors have huge portfolios. They have to rely on proxy advisors to advise them on how to vote. There is very little evidence that they are strongly engaged with companies and can be effective stewards. So my final defect, I think, is this the system which is really going to build trust in business, particularly in the eyes of the up-and-coming generations? Generation Z, the millennials, are they going to see the motivation of simply focusing on the interests of shareholders as being sufficient to motivate them? Is that model of capitalism going to provide them with a purpose and the vision which they need and they demand from business? So my view is that, to conclude, is there's nothing wrong with capitalism, and capitalism is and remains a terrific way to harness the energies, the innovation of individuals and private sector actors. But putting shareholders in priority within this system is just one way of doing this, and it doesn't appear to be a very effective way of doing it. And I think if we're going to meet the challenges of the future in the 21st century, we need a recalibration of this system to make it more suitable for these challenges.
Okay, Roger, thank you very much. Trevor.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. I should first of all explain that there should actually be somebody else sitting in this seat. Sharon White, the now boss of John Lewis, but who couldn't be here. So I think on the grounds that Geoffrey thought I was the person who most looked like Sharon White at Policy Exchange, thought I'd be, but I think this is slightly like replacing Mo Salah with somebody from the youth team because Mo Salah's got COVID. Anyway, I should first of all just say very briefly, though my hobby is writing for and appearing on television, actually I spend most of my life in businesses of various kinds right now, and I want to come to the point about talent in a moment. I chair a executive recruitment company called Green Park, which has grown pretty dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years for reasons which I think are relevant. But I also was president of the John Lewis Partnership for 3-4 years, actually. So I want to say a little bit about that as well. We've been talking about stakeholders and shareholders. Of course, in most companies, I mean, there are many different stakeholders, but there are many different moving parts. But essentially, by and large, we are talking with, we think a lot, if you're on a board, about the investors, the shareholders. You also think a lot about labor, and interestingly, that doesn't seem to, we haven't heard any reference to these people yet. We also think a lot about our clients and customers. I think that one of the reasons that we might be having this discussion is that historically we understood pretty clearly who, if you're on a board, who really mattered to you as directors. Well, actually, by and large, if you are in a business where the real big decisions about capital allocation are about, do you buy a new machine? Do you buy property? Do you buy a new salesperson and put a lot of money into him or her? What you're really thinking about is, what are the people who have invested going to think? How credible are your decisions about capital allocation? I'd like to just make the point, I guess, in my few minutes, that rather straightforward decision-making has rather been undone by the nature of many modern companies and what they do. And this is largely, more than anything else, a matter of technology. If you take very simply the biggest companies in the world, we're thinking Meta, Apple, Netflix, Google, what we used to call the FANGs, but are now something, there's probably some other better acronym now. What is most striking about these outfits? Well, what is most striking about most of them is that basically, for the size of their output, Apple, 2 of them at least now trillion-dollar companies, for their size, the role of investors historically is actually quite small, actually. Either because there's a founder who owns most of it, actually, or because they've grown so dramatically that though the investors have done very well, directors, the extent to which the board really, really has to worry about an investor going somewhere else is relatively small. So technology, I think, has changed the equation about who really matters. And that's why, if you look at the balance sheet of most big companies now, you'll see quite a lot of concern to things which we would historically have thought of as intangibles. We would think about how well are we doing on climate change, what is the or forget the balance sheet, forgive me, think about the risk register. We will think about climate change. We will look at talent. Now, from our point of view, as at Green Park, where I chair, one of our great assists, if I can put it this way, is the employee value proposition. Now, that's actually got very little to do with what investors do and so on. It is this a company that's going to attract talent? Do they want to come and work here? Now, I think that is changing the equation about what is important for directors quite dramatically. Issues like fairness, you mentioned P&O, reputation, these are huge. There are probably accountants in the room here who understand this better, but if I grasp it properly, the issue of valuing intangibles has really become very, very serious for most companies now, in a way it wouldn't have been 30 years ago. All of this seems to me to be around, thank you. The question of how we value what matters to a company, and that rests on what is the process of asset creation. In a world where the biggest companies essentially trade in non-rival goods, where actually the process of asset creation is so different to historically General Motors and all of that, I think that we still don't quite know some of the things that matter. I want to make just lastly a couple of quick points. It seems to me that for most leaders of companies, most boards, there are some new factors that they constantly have to be thinking about, which aren't just about the kind of simple and straightforward notion of accountability to a particular group of people. Take, for example, transparency, which is much more important, I think, in the corporate world than it ever has been. Certainly when I started work, if a company told you it did something or it was like something, you had to believe it because you couldn't tell. Today, both formally and statutorily, you can tell much more. And practically, if you, for example, go onto Glassdoor, you will know things that you would never have known 20 years ago about a company. And this matters. On John Lewis partnership, I may say a bit more in the discussion, but the reason that I think that's an interesting and important model is that it is the single large company that has historically explored a different balance between the significance of investor, labor, and customer. John Lewis put labor first, and that's part of the principal constitution, and it behaves in a different way to most other companies for that reason, because Speed & Lewis's view was that if labor was happy, the customer would be satisfied. And it happened, by the way, that labor also doubled as investors in that situation. But the basic point I really want to make is that we're in a new era where the balance between shareholder, labor, and customer is quite different. And boards are struggling, I think, with working out how to pay the right level of regard to these different forces. And I don't think we've really quite understood that. The one thing that we can say, I think for certain, is that in the fastest growing outfits in most of the Western world, the primacy of the shareholder has essentially been broken, and that understanding how we deal with the other stakeholders has now become so much more important, but we haven't yet discovered how to do it. And by the way, I think, to be honest, that was actually at the heart of Fink's 2018 letter, really, that he was saying, because some of the CEOs that we dealt with were saying he's been telling us for years and years, make money, make money, make money. Now he's telling us to be nice. What's going on here? Actually, Fink was ahead of everybody. Fink understood or understands that this balance has changed quite dramatically. I don't think he's looking at his letter this year. He's quite got to the place where he himself understands what you do about that. But I think at the very least, it's the right thing for an institutional investor to run up a flag that says, everybody think again.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to put a couple of questions to the panel before opening it up. I'm sure you will have questions to pose. And perhaps to Colin, or perhaps Colin and Roger both together. You mentioned Novo Nordisk. It's not obvious to me why companies can't have a purpose while still operating within a shareholder accountability type of framework. You know, I and some colleagues here used to work for the Financial Times. We had a purpose. We had a purpose, which was to make the Financial Times the best possible newspaper. The fact that we were owned by a company that was answerable to shareholders and had to satisfy shareholders that it was making an adequate return, it didn't prevent us from pursuing that purpose. Now, if I understand some of the things that Colin has written in the past year or two, I think he's arguing, correct me if I'm wrong, that the existence of shareholder primacy, as described by Roger, prevents companies from having a purpose, prevents them or causes them to do things which damage the planet or damage society. And I think probably both of you would recommend that something needs to change in company law, corporate governance, and so on, in order to reduce the primacy of shareholders, and only through that kind of reform will the kind of social purpose, emphasis on social purpose come about. But perhaps, Colin, you could comment on that.
Yes, and the question about is a purpose consistent with being a shareholder-owned company is, I think, exactly the source of confusion. The answer, to my mind, is absolutely, and that's precisely what you want to have. You want to have a variety of different forms of ownership in the form of employee ownership, cooperatives, or whatever, but you also want to have stock-owned companies that are traded on stock markets, raise capital on stock markets. It's true that increasingly companies are becoming intangible and other assets are growing in significance relative to the capital that's required to fund plant, buildings, and machinery. But nevertheless, there are still companies that are dependent on raising equity capital. And we should not by any means try and undermine the operation of share-owned companies. The problem is that the notion of a profit, as it's conventionally thought of, and in particular as it's interpreted, I think, incorrectly in terms of what Milton Friedman was saying, is that the purpose of a business is to make money. That is not the purpose of a business. It shouldn't be the purpose. The purpose of a business is to make money from doing things that are of benefit, in particular to customers, but more generally to society. And what I think we're all looking to do is to find ways of ensuring that as the world is changing, as technology is changing, as the significance of external problems, environmental problems grows, that the way in which companies are incentivized is in line with them delivering purposes that are not contrary to the interests of us as customers or employees or societies more generally. And that's where the notion of a purpose as being the determinant of how companies should be delivering on their profitability is so important.
Roger, do you want to add
Yes,
something?
I think it is absolutely possible in a shareholder-controlled company to have a strong social purpose. And we've seen this in many contexts. You often, I think, see it in family business. You see it in many continental European family-owned companies where the family have had a strong ethos, a strong culture which they want to develop, and that's led to a very, shall we say, responsible company. The problem is, though, that in the kind of modern faceless ownership corporation, which is mainly owned by institutional investors who own fragmented stakes in a wide portfolio of companies, it's very difficult to actually impose any kind of purpose for the corporation which differs from profit maximization and shareholder returns, because there's such a disparate group of owners. There's only one thing which can really unite them in common purpose, and that's the idea to maximize returns.
Okay.
And I should just point out one other thing, that Henry Ford was an example of a capitalist who decided that he was going to impose a different purpose on his company and run it in the interest of employees. And he was sued by minority shareholders because that wasn't aligned with the way company law was created and structured.
I wonder if I could ask Trevor a question, and then I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Why aren't there more employee-owned companies? Is there, when you've had experience of John Lewis, and there must be some downsides to being employee-owned as opposed to conventional share-owned, and I wondered whether you might comment on that. Is it some legal thing that prevents companies? I mean, I know you're not the only one. There are other employee-owned companies, but not very many. And I just wondered why that's the case.
Well, I think there are quite a lot of employee-owned companies, but I think actually the core question is why aren't there more big ones like John Lewis?
Yes.
And the answer to that is that Speed & Lewis basically said that it was an experiment. And he launched the experiment on the grounds that he thought this was a better way to live, and the company was only part of it. There were all sorts of plans for essentially creating another Bourneville and so on and so forth. So he had a greater purpose than the creation of the company itself. And I think that's probably part of the reason that there aren't more, because when you create an employee-owned company, it presupposes, or you try to create an entity of that size, it presupposes a lot of other things around that entity that would support it. I should say that the point about, one of the questions that's often asked in John Lewis is, are we a partnership that happens to do retail, or are we a retailer that is employee-owned? The actual answer that most people inside the company would give you now, and would always have given you, is that we are a partnership that happens to do retail. The essence of the company is not that we are great retailers, though we are, but that we are a partnership. And that the point about that is that it privileges the labour element of the entity in a particular way. And this brings me, if I may briefly, to the point that you've been discussing about the shareholders' interest. I mean, I think your point is right, that in the modern world, most shareholders can't and don't even want to influence purpose. They don't want to. I mean, when people talk about passive, that's actually what they really mean. They mean passive investors. And I think that we just have to bear in mind that shareholders, by and large, don't want to influence the outward purpose. They do want, for perfectly good reasons, pension fund and so on, you want to make sure you've got returns. That's your job. That's what you're there for. You're not there to make sure that the company sells better boxes. And it's worth saying, by the way, when we talk about corporate purpose, there is absolutely no necessary relationship between a positive, defined and determined corporate purpose and the good of society. I would shut down every cigarette company tomorrow if it were in my power, because there is absolutely nothing in that enterprise that is, in my view, serves a social purpose. But those who invest in it, those who work in it, can see a purpose, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the good of society.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to find a few questions. I'm also inviting questions from our online people, and I will keep an eye on that screen. But okay, question one. Yeah.
Thank you.
And sorry, if I could just ask, if you could just mention your name and your affiliation, if you could, when you ask a question.
That will be even better. Mehmet Ögütçü, Chairman of London Energy Club. This was an excellent discussion. Thank you for that. Two questions I have, if I may. One is, we discuss here faceless company owned by institutional investors. But the backbone of our economies are the SMEs and family businesses. I think it might be useful to give a flavor to how shareholder value versus stakeholder value could be achieved in this regard. Second question is actually why I came to this meeting. I thought that perhaps we might be discussing different models of capitalism in the future. You know, impact investment-driven capitalism, wild capitalism, state capitalism, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, social capitalism. So where are we heading in the future in this direction? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so I'll try and answer both those questions together because I think they're both great questions. First of all, SMEs are, as you say, the lifeblood of economies, certainly in terms of numbers, they outweigh any other form of company, but in terms of employment, they're a very large segment of total employment as well. And there you do see often a clearly defined notion of what the purpose of a business is. Indeed, when a company is started off, if the founder of the company hasn't got a clear notion of the purpose, it's unlikely to get very far. What happens, and it comes to some of the points that Roger was making, that as the company expands, raises capital, and potentially then lists on the stock market or is sold off to another, that notion of the purpose gets lost. And it's at that stage that one encounters the sorts of issues and conflicts that we're talking about here. Now, in relation to the second part of your question, what we've been talking about here is a very Anglo-American view of the world, namely that large companies are essentially listed on stock markets and have dispersed owners that are these large asset managers. That is not true of the vast proportion of the largest companies around the world. The largest companies around the world are, for the most part, owned still by families and in some cases by the state. Those are the dominant shareholders of most of even the largest listed companies in the world. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that this notion of shifting inevitably to a dispersed ownership system does not necessarily create a mechanism by which one can retain that notion of a purpose. Now, it's by no means the case that family firms are always angelic. On the contrary, we've seen many examples of exactly the contrary. But nevertheless, there are many family firms that are able to take a long-term, intergenerational view of what the company is there to do and to retain that notion even while they become listed on stock markets. And finally, in relation to your question about the role of the state and capitalism in China and elsewhere, what we are currently observing is that the notion of the role of the state in terms of playing an ownership function is coming up against our conventional view of privatization, that what we needed to do was to sell off companies and to put them into the private domain. What we've observed in this country is a great deal of discontent with what has arisen in the process of doing that and simply relying on regulation as the means of aligning private and public interest. We need to find better ways of doing that. I don't think that in general this state ownership is the right solution to the problem, but simply putting companies onto the stock market and looking to regulation, for example, in the water sector, as ways of avoiding the immense abuses that we've been observing has clearly not been the solution.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience here, and then, to be fair, invite some of our online watchers to participate. So please.
Thank you. Nick Lakin from Kingfisher. We own B&Q and Screwfix, so listed UK FTSE 100. I'm personally very passionate about the role of business in society and business, society, and government, and how do the three cogs turn or not turn together effectively. I've done this in 3 different industries so far, so some degrees of experiences of wins and losses. I think a lot of what the panel is saying is a lot of eminently sensible stuff. I would just, a couple of observations and then one kind of more broader question. I think purpose is, it's okay, it can be a bit of a distraction as a subject of debate, because I think it's about driving genuine change through an organisation, and purpose is only part of a framer of that. I think there needs to be a healthy tension between profits and society, or whatever else you want to call it. However, there are some very clear tensions. I think we talked about the profit piece. However, there is a lot of businesses that are orientated on long-term, loss-making, destructive strategies that have greater societal consequences. I think there's a challenge on transparency and what listed companies are required to be transparent versus what, say, private companies have to do, which I think causes more challenges in this difficulty. And then I suppose to make it more of a question for the panel as well, there's always obvious tensions between doing what's right and doing what's profitable. And those are great, healthy debates that take place within companies. So speaking as a retailer, there's an interesting tension live at the moment. The Treasury is consulting on an online sales tax, and in exchange, they want to reduce the shops tax. It's called business rates. But when giants like Amazon pay no corporation tax in Europe, or a business like John Lewis advocates against an online sales tax, when a business rates cut would save shops and give consumers more choice all over the country, I think there's a really big philosophical debates that you get into discussion about. And it's not just always a binary choice about who are the angels, who are the devils, or how do you take this forward. So good to hear panel's view about those kind of issues.
Perhaps I could ask one more question and then you could...
Neil Carmichael, Chief Executive of UCEC. I've really got 2 questions, and I want to sort of return to this issue of whose capitalism are we talking about? Because you can talk about Denmark, Germany, and you talk and we discover the Mittelstand in Germany. We even discover Mittelstand type businesses in the United States. So I think we really have to be very careful about whose capitalism we are actually talking about. And I think that will help us to distill things like risk, which hasn't really been mentioned here, but I think it needs to be. Regulation, which has, but that's an important factor too. And if we just simply talk about ownership, we tend to get driven into this sort of, this is about profit bit, when actually it's not always about profit, it's about sustainability, it's about longevity. That's my first real question. My second one is, what is the big problem with British capitalism? Well, as I see it, it's lack of productivity growth. So I think we should be asking the question, what do we do about the capital system that we have here to address that particular problem? Because we are really going to need to do that if we insist on going it alone and watching everybody else outperform us.
Okay. Do you want to say anything?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that's the problem of the British economy, and what ultimately drives productivity growth is innovation in the economy. And what I fear is that the type of governance system that we've developed, which has been very much focused on the rights of institutional investors, has actually worked to the detriment of promoting innovation in companies. Compared to the United States, compared to other countries. And we're now trying to rebalance that. The FCA fairly recently changed its listing rules to allow, for example, dual-class shares, the purpose of which is to shield, actually, companies from the kind of short-termism of many institutional investors and thereby allow innovation to take place and to allow us to develop some of the tech giants of the future in the UK. So I think we are waking up to this. I almost feel that we have developed in the UK first-class corporate governance with a second-class economy. Due to our focus on investor rights and shareholder rights, whereas other countries have got perhaps less good governance in the eyes of many, but their economies roar ahead and do better.
Okay, I want to ask a couple of online questioners. First one from Stephen Massey, who I think is ready to pose a question.
Yes. I don't know if you can see me. I look like I'm, whether you can see me or not, my camera doesn't seem to be working. But I had a question really aimed at Roger Barker and his remarks about the primacy of shareholders. I mean, I do think that in your remarks you rather minimised this concept of capital risk. And yes, you pointed and you refer a lot to institutional investors, but of course, as we know, institutional investors don't control all the companies in this country or in other countries. There are private investors, and outside the public company sector, there aren't many institutional investors. But capital risk is so completely fundamental to our system, hence the capitalist system, as we call it. So, shareholders have to be rewarded for the risk that they're taking, whether diversified or not. And if you look at most smaller companies and family companies, someone has to take the risk on a working capital in those companies. And it strikes me that this is a very, very fundamental aspect of our system, and one that predominantly works quite well. The other question I had, and I guess that was more of a comment, is the idea that most companies aren't employee-owned. Well, as we know, if you look at just around us, look at the private equity firms, the accountancy firms, the law firms, most of which are very successful and sometimes very, very large partnerships. Why are they partnerships rather than publicly owned? Because they don't need a lot of capital. When they need capital, they go to the market or to other sources, and then the ownership changes because the providers of those capital of that capital will demand ownership and control. So I'd just be interested in the panel's comments on those thoughts.
Yes, so a quick comment.
Just a comment that my view is that this notion that the providers of equity capital are the risk takers is increasingly an outmoded rationalization. For me, it's based on a world where you needed a big chunk of capital to invest in physical capital, to buy a factory, to buy machinery, for old-fashioned style industries. As Trevor was saying, that the companies of today are all about intangible capital. They're about the people operating within it. They're about the intellectual property. So that idea that the absolute key contributors to a company are the people who are putting in this money to get the company going to start with. It's I think less and less relevant to the business of today.
Okay. One more online question from Antonio, if he's still there. If not, we'll go to Andy McGregor.
Good evening. I'm an optometrist in Northumberland and have a very small family company, my wife and myself and 6 employees. No expert, but my question really is, what does the panel think about the idea of increasing the amount of shares owned by ordinary workers in the companies rather than just the directors and people getting massive dividends?
Yes. Colin, do you want to say something?
Shares owned by all the employees. Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, absolutely. I think that the notion of share ownership does not have to be associated with raising capital and is not necessarily the best way of motivating people in organizations. That the use of share ownership to incentivize employees and to reward employees, I think, is something that we should see much more of in the UK context. And indeed, those companies that have adopted a wider form of employee ownership within their organizations have, on the evidence, performed well as a consequence of doing that. So I think that is something that should be encouraged as a way of addressing some of the issues we're talking about.
I think I'll have perhaps 2 more questions then. Both, yes, go ahead. Have we got a microphone?
don't need a mic, I suppose. My name is Hugo de Berg, and I'm from Tsinghua University, Schwarzman College, which is a American College of International Relations.
Short question, please. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was slightly discombobulated by Roger Barker and Colin Mayer because one said what the other one was supposed to say, and the other said what the other one was supposed to say. So to try and tease out, what they really think about shareholders, I want to ask them what their view is of the sale of Cadbury to Heinz and the discussions which went on over Nvidia and ARM recently, where, as I understand it, shareholders only had an opinion, had some influence over the possible outcomes. Mm-hmm. Is that right? These companies both have vast numbers of stakeholders. I don't have to enumerate them, from the university to the country to the local government, the original inventors, goodness knows who else, the local community and so forth. Was it right that the only people who could decide what was to happen to those companies was the shareholders?
You go first.
Absolutely not. And I think that the problem, shall we say, of shareholder capitalism crystallizes in a takeover situation where it simply becomes a matter of running an auction to sell the company to the highest bidder. And the stakeholder perspective doesn't really get a look in there. Now, I know that in the case of Cadbury, there were some commitments made to stakeholders about retaining investment and production in certain factories, which were soon abandoned, of course, which showed the complete weakness of those stakeholder protections. And that to me, probably the takeover situation, along with how we structure executive pay, those are the two key areas where I think we do need to recalibrate our system so that a broader group of stakeholders has more of a perspective than just the shareholders.
Okay.
And well, I mean, there were both of us who were.
Oh, yes.
So let me just point out why you shouldn't be discombobulated at all, because we are actually saying exactly the same thing. Namely that in that case, just think about it. The question, the notion of a purpose that I described was profitable solutions, not profiting from producing problems. Okay? So the notion of a profitable takeover is one that does not end up creating a significant cost for the rest of society or the environment or employees. It's a matter of determining what is the correct way of determining a value-enhancing takeover. The notion of profit that we currently have is being seriously mismeasured and thereby value creation. And that is the reason why a lot of these difficulties that we talk about are arising.
So how are you going to assure it?
You assure it through exactly what I've just been describing. You measure the impact of the company, the way in which measurement is currently being undertaken, and you thereby determine what are the costs of rectifying and remedying the damages that are inflicted on others. That derives a true profit.
Okay, last question then, please.
Yes, Henry Evans. I just want to ask a quick question on the practicalities of a rollout of this new tomorrow. Does the panel think that it would require international agreement? And if they don't, what are you going to do about companies that are, in this day and age, much more mobile, aren't prepared to forum shop? And if you do think it requires international agreement on this change of structure, given the sort of shambolic track record of tax policy agreement, which is every bit as ambitious as this, is this a realistic change in the medium term?
Well, yeah.
You carry on. I just want to make a more general point to answer this gentleman's point.
Yes. I would just make the point to you that we're not living in a kind of globally standardized approach in the world of corporate governance. There is huge divergence and variation across jurisdictions, and in some respects the UK stands out as an outlier in terms of being a shareholder-friendly jurisdiction. So I think slightly redressing the balance merely would put the UK alongside many other countries, and it far from sort of causing business in the UK to collapse.
Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to just briefly say, I understand that much discussion is going on, but I think we need to be careful not to be talking about the past, to be honest. Much of what we've been talking about does not for 1 second begin to apply to, for example, Amazon or any part of fintech right now, which are creating value in a way that doesn't really correspond to some of the kind of considerations that we've been talking about. Just in response to the gentleman's point here, I think is a good one, I would simply say, I'd only say that obviously nobody wants predatory capitalism. I mean, that's the story that everybody wants to get rid of right now. The answer to predatory capitalism isn't necessarily state capitalism, China, or China's socialism with Chinese characteristics. Some might say that British capitalism is capitalism with British characteristics, i.e., a certain overbearing influence of the state and all that flows with it. I think we've still got to work out how in this new world, where value is created in truly novel ways, how we deal with some of the new things, just practical instruments. I mean, the fact that the accounting bodies internationally are having a devil of a time working out how to value certain kinds of assets, which are real assets, but we can't actually at the moment count them. You can't write them down on paper. So I think before we get too fixed on models, I think we just need to start thinking about what are the instruments that we have to deal with some of the new features of the way that we build wealth. And I just, one sentence, say that I think in much of this new world, because of the ascendancy of talent, brackets, let's call it IP, let's call it labor, we are going to have to think not so much about sharing income, but about assets. A lot of young people rather, in tech firms, they don't want LTIPs, but they do want a chunk of the business because they can see how quickly it grows, and if it works, then they're going to be much better off, etc. Apple employees want a share of Apple as much as they want a decent salary because they know where that's going. And I think we're just going to have to think very, very differently about the distribution of power within the corporate world as between the shareholder, the worker, let's call it, and by the way, what does the customer get back? Partly because the customer now, and I'm not just talking about individuals, I'm talking about businesses, can be so mobile as between who they buy from.
Okay, I think that's a good note to finish looking to the future, not the past. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for your questions, and thank you for the members of the panel for their contributions. Thank you.